Oh, yeah. Now you can. Hi, gorgeous. Look at that front view.
Hello.
Can you see me? Yes. So I just need to set up the slides and then I'll turn back to you. Sorry. Hi. You look at Catherine. Slides. Okay, so I'll show you slides from my laptop.
Oh, right. Okay.
Unless you want to share it yourself.
I might do it here because there's a couple of slide-ins. If that's okay. Do you want me to do a practice test just to make sure?
Just to make sure you have the privileges, the admin.
Okay, bear with me. Let me just get them ready. I have so many different PowerPoints open right now.
Oh no, so do I. Oh God.
I know.
Problem.
I lost a whole lot I prepared on Tuesday. I was just, horrid. Okay, bear with me. I'll just check. Okay, share screen, share, and I'll just do.
Yeah, it's working fabulous. And you just tell me, I have them open on laptop, so you just tell me I'm here at backup.
Oh, you're wonderful. That's brilliant to know because chances are,
yeah. Okay.
at this time of night, something might go wrong.
Find it. Hold on. Oh my God, what time is it?
And I'll go.
All right, then, so you will use, so the sound is coming from here, so I'm going to put this next to you. You should have the best audio and sound possible. And then,
yeah, that's better.
It's probably better if you move your computer away.
Okay.
Unless you need it. And then, you don't have slides to share, do you?
No.
Then it's fine. I think that's quite good then.
So who else is going to be there in the room with you? Is Ida?
Okay, unfortunately, I can't do it on my phone. How can I do this? Maybe I can do.
There's in the room. Everybody's moved because it gets too noisy in this room. This is the problem.
I see.
Can you hear an echo, or is it okay?
It's fine. Yeah, it's not too bad.
Okay, well, that's much better actually. What I'll do is I'll do this. Okay.
So if you're speaking first, yeah.
Okay, guys. Why is it that I can't open for some reason my documents? There's this weird thing happening where I cannot.
Oh, when they're downloaded onto your computer.
I can't get back into Google, and I just want to be able to download your email. But why is it not? Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Why is this not allowing me to get back to all of my Microsoft?
Some people haven't told me.
Okay.
Again.
Welcome, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. We have about 100 people who have registered for this workshop. So just give us a bit of time. Everyone's calling from different places, but we welcome you all. Maybe what you can do is already in the chat, put who you are and where you're coming from. That would be fabulous. Thank you. And welcome to Philippe and the team and Katherine. And I see Hans, I think you've joined as well. So our speakers are already here, and I've got Ken Webster next to me as well. So just give us about 5 minutes while we let people start joining. And as I said, we have about 100 people who have registered. Hans, we can see you now. Are you unmuted? Yeah, fabulous.
Yes, it's solved. Okay, that's good.
Can everyone else actually put their video on and unmute themselves? Is it okay? Yeah, I see you, Ida. Wonderful that you've joined. Welcome.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, just waiting. Salut, Philippe. Good to see you.
Hi, salut.
Bonjour, Philippe.
Hello, hello, Hans.
I'm just going to wait till we have half of the registration. As I said, we have 100 people who have registered today, and we're now already at 34. So I'm just going to wait another 5 minutes before we start, and then we'll start if everyone's okay with that. Okay.
Is the cheese in the background for the reception, Sandrine? Because then I'm set, I'm in Copenhagen.
So, my dear friend, you know where I am. I am in the Triodos offices, where the Club of Rome Brussels office is located. For those of you who don't know about the history of the incredible bank Triodos, who has always been lending to community projects. Actually, they have put themselves here in Rue Haute, which is one of, used to be the Marolles, and one of the most, let's say, economically struggling regions of Belgium, but in particular Brussels. And one of the projects that they have invested in is in the production of cheese. Hans. So hence why there is cheese behind me.
Yeah, that is great. Yeah.
As a local craft.
It's also one of the more colorful parts of Brussels, of course, the Marolles.
I agree. I agree. And it's a beautiful place, and you're all welcome to come to our offices when you're in Brussels. But I think now I'm going to start. We're at 42, so in about a couple more minutes, and then we'll start. It'll be 5 past, and welcome you all officially. Good. Okay, I think I'm going to now officially open this incredible meeting. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. I am Sandrine Dixson-Declève, co-president of the Club of Rome. And I'm now officially opening the virtual workshop translating beyond GDP indicators into well-being policy. What we wanted to do in this meeting, first of all, is to bring to you some new material that we have been developing through the work of both Earth for All and the Club of Rome, and very much which we have brought forward in order to feed into the incredible new Beyond Growth conference that will actually be in Brussels during the middle of May, which has actually been started and initiated by Philippe Lambert, member of the European Parliament Green Group, who is also on this call with us. And I want to thank again Philippe for his incredible leadership in ensuring that we have a multiple party Beyond Growth conference in the European Parliament that many of us are very excited about. This for me is, I think, the moment, it's the unique moment where we can truly work together to unpack what Beyond Growth looks like in practice, to ensure then what that also means in terms of policy. This workshop itself is part of an incredible relationship that the Club of Rome has developed with the European Environment Agency under Hans' leadership, and also with the European Commission Research and Innovation DG under the leadership of Peter Droll. And what we've wanted to do in our work together is see where there could be complementarity between the different organizations in terms of thinking through, as I indicated, the way in which we can practically shift to the next level with regard to addressing new indicators, thinking through what those new indicators mean with regard to policy, looking at the current tensions and pushback that we currently have in terms of the adoption of new indicators, and then thinking through collectively, what does that mean in terms of the offering that we are giving, not only to policymakers, but to people to bring them on this journey? What does that look like? How can we truly think through this together and bring together some options, some real tools in the toolbox that will enable us to transform our economy and move beyond GDP? We know that we have that pushback. We know that we're seeing now, and of course, Katherine will be speaking about this a bit, the way in which the well-being governments put in place their new economic model and have been moving through the thinking of new indicators to growth, but by the same token, have started to have some pushback within their economies and also because of the way the governments have shifted. So how can we create also a level of continuity and make sure that whatever we do together and whatever policy we actually have in place stays in place, that it is not just germane by or promoted by one government, but actually will be, as we've seen through GDP, a continuum of proposals from different governments as we move forward. Otherwise, we will fall on our faces because we know full well that then we will not be able to anchor beyond GDP indicators and thinking in a continuum of different governments across the globe and for a longer time period. So really what we've wanted to do in this particular workshop is build on the last workshop that we had just last week, actually, hosted by Peter Droll and the European Commission DG Research and Innovation, that was already starting to unpack some of the work that's been done in the European Commission by DG Foresight, by actually DG Research and Innovation, but also some of the work that's being done through the Environment Agency and other organizations linked to the institutions, to then think through now, what are those key tensions? We're going to start our conversation with some of the work that's been done by our members of the Club of Rome, Ida Kubiszewski and also Robert Costanza, who are very much with their research students and their research that they're doing at UCL, gathering the different indicators that we have across the globe, the different thinking that we have across the globe, and how we can actually start to think through What does this mean in terms of landing on specific indicators, or how do we build a narrative which would actually be potentially feasible for a variety of different countries at the same time? And also, how do we ensure that we don't, through all of these different indicators, and this is something that comes up time and time again, and has just come up in a conversation I've had in the OECD, create confusion? How do we ensure that actually we can simplify and start to land on which indicators do we start to bundle, knowing full well that we have to tailor the indicators and tailor our offering to different countries, whether they are low, middle, or high income countries, whether they are in the north or whether they are in the south. And then we will move from looking at those alternative indicators and the possibilities and limitations into some work that Katherine Trebeck has been doing actually recently, and the discussions that we have had, Katherine and myself, on how we can start to look at what have been the key challenges and learnings in implementing new metrics into practice, so that we have a real world understanding of what is the pushback and where can we unpack those tensions and that pushback and have some solutions to that and some answers to that, and strategically think through what does that mean in practice, so that collectively we can work in our different regions. Right now we're focusing on Europe, but we can work in our different regions, build on that knowledge, and also ensure that we can also help each other as we try to move forward in the adoption of these new indicators. And then we want to close with some reflections from Ken Webster. And we've had this morning a fantastic workshop here in the Brussels office, looking at how we can move from indicators into practice, and in particular have some very key tools in the toolbox that will enable both policymakers, but also citizens, to understand the importance of shifting to a well-being economy and the way in which a well-being economy builds more equitable systems. How a well-being economy very much focuses on poverty alleviation, redistribution of wealth, and enhancing the lives and livelihoods of more people than just the few. And this will build on the discussions and the work that's been done by Ken, but also obviously through Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity. One of our key solutions in terms of bringing people on the journey, ensuring that we also start to really build a dividend perspective based also on the impacts of our extractive economy on the global commons, is to think through what is a universal basic dividend as a lever, and how does this tool enable us to also sell the incredible importance of shifting to a well-being economy. And then I've asked Philippe to give us some reflections, and then followed by Hans, both from the European Parliament perspective, and then Hans will conclude, including myself. Now, I want to give some regrets coming from Till Kellerhoff, who's been helping us set up this entire workshop, who's unfortunately incredibly ill in bed and so wanted to co-moderate this with me, and has been working so hard on making sure that we have this conversation. So I just wanted to indicate that poor Till, unfortunately, is not here, so you're stuck with me. So why don't we move on and open up with Ida. I'm so happy that Ida's here to be able to share some of the work that she and Bob have been doing with some of their students, and to lead us through this work as a real sound input into the way in which we can really build this movement that we need around key indicators. Ida, do you have a presentation I think that you want to share?
Yes, thanks, Sandrine. Thanks for that great introduction. And let me pull up this. Okay, everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah,
yep.
We can see it.
So thanks for having me here today. And I just want to preface this presentation by saying that what I'm going to be presenting is a work in progress. And so these are just very preliminary results. Things might still shift. We are still working on this, and it is a work in progress, basically. But what we've been working on is, we had a class. So I'm currently at the University College London. And we had a class of master students that we were looking for a project, a very hands-on project to do. And we decided to work with them around well-being indicators. We had them collect, so let me walk you through the processes so you know why we're kind of halfway done with it. We had them collect any indicators they could find around well-being out in the world. Look at not only academic papers, but look at reports, look at just scour the internet. We currently have about 375 well-being indicators that they've looked. They have a various degree of comprehensivity, as I would say. What we had them do is divide their findings and look at what domains these indicators included and what components. So domains are sort of the broad ideas behind them. So environment, for example, would be one broad one, as an example, and components would be the specific measures that were used. On average, with these 375 indicators, we found that just over, on average, they had just over five domains and around 35 components. So that's an average, and I'll show you. And I just want to point out that this has been a large group effort with quite a few master's and PhD students that were working on this. Here's the distribution of the domains. So you can see that some of these indicators have very few domains, one, and some majority have three, and then they go down. The interesting thing about this is that how comprehensive they are is still something we are working on. So some are very much focused on economy, like GDP, some on society, some on environment, in various things. So looking at what they include, the one big thing we are doing is we're putting together an index of the degree of agreement between these domains, because we're finding that although a lot of these indicators may be calling their domain something else, they're really synonyms. And so we're finding that there's a lot of agreement between these indicators overall, just slightly different language is being used around them. That is a different story with components. The components vary quite excessively in some cases. However, speaking to experts in these fields can provide a better understanding of what components could be used to then measure some of these domains. So that's a broad idea. This was from a paper that came out earlier this year, where they took about 15 different indicators and analyze kind of the domains and components that were within them. And I thought this was interesting that they came up with 5 main domains and 12 specific sort of components that could be in it. What I did notice in this, and this came out of the EU earlier this year, what I did notice is that climate neutrality is sort of the only environmental indicator. And that's quite limited, actually. There isn't access to green spaces. There isn't anything broader besides climate. And there is air quality, which is important to health. It's sort of an environmental measure as well. So just understanding how we're looking at each of these and making sure that the key aspects that people perceive or don't perceive, but that contribute to their well-being are within whatever indicator we choose. This was a study we did got published last year, and it's looking at the SDGs specifically because they are such an important indicator right now in the world. And I think it's important to remember, so the SDGs, 17 goals, 169 targets, 232 indicators, unless you subdivide them as the UN recommends, and then there's 650 indicators. At this point, not a single country is able to measure them. Not even the developed countries. So now if you start talking to developed countries, they're not even measuring a quarter, many of them. US is actually one of the worst. And they are a developed country that are just not doing it. There's been studies showing that just to measure them, a country has to spend about $3 billion per year. That totals to $45 billion in the 15 years to measure the SDGs. To achieve them by 2030 would require about a $5 to $7 trillion a year commitment. That's not going to happen before 2030. So what we ended up looking at is, just as an exercise, we want to see which of those were most important when looking at life satisfaction. So life satisfaction in many ways is limited because it's perceived life satisfaction. So asking people on a scale of 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life overall? So not just instantaneous happiness, but in general. And we basically correlated that with every country in the world. We split up into developed, developing countries as defined by the UN, and then looked at all. And we found that 8 SDG indicators captures 84% of the variance of life satisfaction. And those are the critical things. And some of them are a bit different. So for example, internet use, so access to the web, to the world, and things like electronic waste generated. Yes, it's a weird one, but it's a proxy. It's a proxy for how accessible are electronics. And so we have to remember that this is what is perceived and then what is measured. And so I just want to point out that while the SDGs require all these measurements, there is a more efficient way of doing this. This is from a paper we published in Nature in 2014, which looked at a handful of indicators and split them up into 3 primary groupings. So what you see at the top are basically in green, are basically indicators that take GDP and adjust it in some way to help sort of improve some of the issues with GDP that we all know about. The second part, the part in blue, are indicators that directly try to get at well-being or life satisfaction. So surveys asking people directly. And the red part at the bottom are looking at sort of ones that take potentially objective indicators, subjective indicators, put them together in some kind of composite indicators. And so out of our, out of our 375, we find that 8 of them adjusted GDP in some way. 39 directly asked people in surveys about their well-being, and 241 were composite. You will notice that this does not add up to 375, and that's because, as I said, we're still working on cleaning up the database and making sure everything's filled in. So this will be all filled out, but these are just preliminary data. So we've cleaned up just under 300. So work in progress, as I said. And then also looking at spatial scale. So one of the things we kind of looked at with all these indicators is at what scale were those indicators meant to be used at? And majority, as you see here, are looking at a national scale. There's some regional or subnational, city, local, individual. There are some that said they could be used at multiple scales. What I think is very important to mention when talking about scale is it's important what the use of the indicator is. For comparability, for example, across countries, national is super important. To actually look at how a nation and how the people in a nation are doing, the problem with looking at national is that it averages out a lot of the information. For example, Australia, where Katherine is right now, and I spent quite a lot of time, the life satisfaction in Australia is about 7.3 approximately. However, there are entire communities that have a life satisfaction of 0, 1, or 2. there's something very wrong in those communities, but those are averaged out when looking at a national indicator. So I think it depends what purpose we're using these indicators for and how do we actually measure it to make sure that those that are most at risk aren't ignored or averaged out. We also looked at sort of some of the Google hits. So did a basic search in one day. We put all 375 of these indicators in Google and just looked at how many hits came out. And I think it's important to notice that the y-axis here is on a log scale. So these are significant differences as you go along. And it's interesting to look at too then, who created these indicators? Who sort of publicized them? Who made them popular? So Human Development Index is one of the most popular, run by the UN and has been around for a while. So just looking at popularity amongst the public, but then amongst academics as well. So just a quick comparison between Google Hits and Google Scholar Hits. Just to see how much they're studied and mentioned in academia versus how much they're just up on the web. And you see a relatively good correlation, R-squared of 0.3. Social sciences, that's not bad, I've been told. I come from the hard sciences, so if anything below 0.9, we kind of have a bit of an issue. But I was told 0.3 is pretty good. And so looking at these is what's been studied. What do we know about these indicators? And then looking at the future of indicators. So I think one of the most important things that is coming out of this database of 375 indicators is that there's a lot of agreement. And we need to get consensus among a full range of stakeholders globally, because this has to be a global initiative. Right now, within the next year, the EU, World Bank, the UK ONS, OECD are all coming out with their own indicators. From my sources and people I've talked to work on these, there isn't a lot of conversations between these groups about what is that one indicator. How do we create that consensus? We know from the 375 we've been looking at is that there's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of synonyms being used, different words, but synonyms. There's a lot of overlap. How do we use that? We also have to remember that we need to use a broader range of data sources. A lot of our indicators that were created in 1950s. I'm thinking of the GDP, for example. It's before very sophisticated computers. How do we use new technology to improve data collection? And on that note, remembering that understanding what available metrics is one thing, but what do we really want to know? What do we measure? Can we identify what we want to know and then find some of the new technologies to measure it? Can we get some of these things through proxies using remote sensing? Can AI help with some of this? And I know there's been a lot of critique of AI and ChatGPT, but what are the positive uses for something? Can we create comprehensive dynamic models to complement and replace some of these static systems, like the national accounts? How do we move forward with the new technology and ensure that it's working for us? And I just want to point out two books. The one on the left, Sustainable Wellbeing Futures, came out in 2020, where we looked at some of these issues. And then Towards an Integrative Science of Wellbeing is coming out later this month. And we worked with a psychologist and a medical doctor to look at different perspectives of well-being, since those communities often don't chat to each other. So how do they overlap? How can they have that conversation? So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ida. I think we're going to have many questions, and this really starts off a fabulous conversation. And part of this conversation already started last week, actually. in terms of the multitude of indicators, the different organizations that are coming forward with their indicators, and the way in which we can start to build kind of a stakeholder consensus around core indicators and recommendations to different governments. So thank you. I mean, wonderful that we're already with what we have, even though you haven't finished. When do you think that it will be finished, your assessment?
We're hoping by the end of summer that we'll be able to start think about submitting a paper, but have a clean database where we could start talking about the results and synthesis, so on.
Fantastic. Then what I propose is that we make sure to have another workshop end of summer so that you can present your results. Great. Before we go into a conversation, which we are planning about an hour's worth of discussion and exchange with all of you, I want to move now to Katherine, who I think is going to build on this very nicely, also speaking through some of the ways in which she has seen firsthand, but also conversations that she's had with governments with regard to the implementation of a well-being economy and the economic model and looking at indicators. Katherine has a wealth of experience in this area, working through the Wellbeing Alliance that many of us are linked to, myself as an ambassador, but also many of us as members of the Club of Rome are also a part of the We All family. And it's just wonderful to have you with us. And Katherine, thank you. I know I don't know if it's 11 now or 11:30, and it will be very late. 12:30. So really appreciate that you're with us from Australia.
Such a pleasure, Sandrine. There was no way I was going to miss such an important conversation. So hi, everyone. And I will say it's really worth being up so very late here when I'm seeing so many lovely familiar faces on my screen. So great to see you all. As Sandrine mentioned, Earth for All and the Club of Rome have commissioned me to draft a bit of a paper sharing the experience, particularly initially, of Scotland, New Zealand and Wales, but we'll go further than that in future iterations. Really their experience in trying to get the ideas for economic system change on the agenda, whether that's the agenda writ large or various pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, because both are important. How do we get that taken up by political actors? And like Ida's, it's very much a work in progress, so it's emerging unpublished ideas. What I'm going to do is offer the big picture first of all, and then run that ruler over the indicator story. Essentially because indicators are such a huge piece of the jigsaw puzzle in economic system change. So I'm going to start with the bad news, and that is that this is a hard conversation. There is a lot of pushback, and a lot of you probably will be feeling that in a very real way at the moment. So I'm going to just talk through some of the pushbacks and pain points that emerged particularly in the Scottish experience, but also comparing that to what happened in Wales and New Zealand, just to really contextualize how that then plays out for indicators particularly. And the first one is not particularly due to any inadequacy of strategy or political rivalries, but the very simple nature of system incumbency. So built up around the current state of affairs are established networks, are relationships, are hierarchies of status, and these feed into routine ways of doing things built on existing legislation and policies and path dependencies. And particularly in Scotland, what happened is that these played out to reassert the status quo and made ideas of changing seem either too hard or even heretical. And so even if you do have good, strong political support for change, there's a powerful weighting against change that means inaction and delivery is invariably slow. And of course, the good news is, though, that COVID was a bit of an exception to that rule. The next is the lack of bandwidth. What we've seen is that so often other policy goals simply get in the way and overwhelm the conversation. In Scotland, certainly a lot of political airtime is taken up with the question of constitutional change and Scottish independence. And so you get political barbs thrown around that issue rather than keeping the government accountable for tangible delivery of change elsewhere. In New Zealand, there was a huge emphasis and wide divisions over the New Zealand response to the COVID crisis that similarly tapped the bandwidth of political actors. And so the short-term nature of a lot of political discussion, responding from one crisis to the next, whether that's Ukraine or the cost of living, etc., in a way leaves the path clear for apparently orthodox parent solutions to be maintained. The next issue is around deliberate blockers, and it seems that there are almost 3 levels of blocking. So first is by those who really believe that they benefit from the current economic model. And so shifting to one that brings greater fairness and sustainability would for them represent a form of loss, be it pride, power, influence, status. And what happens is that this blocking can manifest as outright hostility, creating political heat, picking off some of the soft supporters of the agenda, briefing against the agenda, creating divisions amongst allies. And a stark example in really recent times of this sort of pushback to a proposal that I think has real resonance with economic system change is the surge of conspiracy theories around the 15-minute neighbourhood idea, to the extent that one of its leading advocates is receiving death threats. And so I just want to quote to you from a petition on of solidarity for him on change.org, because I think it's really apt for the wider agenda. And change.org explains, the 15-minute city confronts people and cities with problems that have arisen with the ways we have been dealing with mobility in the past decades. For those for whom this worked well, this feels as a loss, or even as a frontal attack on their lifestyles. This makes the 15-minute city idea vulnerable to become part of conspiracy theories. This tension is a normal part of any transition, any transformational change, where people win and people lose, where the balances between different rights and privileges are being discussed. So that's one level of blocking. The next one is simply a sense of complacency with the adequacy of the current system, which here manifests more as the dead hand of inaction and recalcitrance. These sorts of blockers get a lot of airtime and they're able to give a lot of commentary. And so they get the message that business as usual is okay more frequently. And then thirdly, there's a very much less hostile but quite influential mode of blocking amongst those who might share some of the bigger goals of the agenda, but potentially perceive, and I use that word deliberately, perceive some of these goals as in contrast with what they're prioritizing, what they're foregrounding. So for example, the idea that environmental objectives are in contrast or counter to the goal of job creation or livelihood sustenance, or even that acute needs, and I've heard this a lot recently from colleagues in Scotland, that acute needs are so profound that focusing on narrow economic growth is a necessary evil to fund service provision and redistribution. So that's blockers. The next one is co-option and weak implementation. And this is in a way the flip side to the issue of blocking. And this is what you see deliberately or otherwise, the terminology and the rhetoric around, say, things like the wellbeing economy used as a cover for different agendas or to badge less bold actions, which hollows out the vision and then also preserves the status quo. The next one is not having an adequate support base for this. In New Zealand, this was particularly acute, where the approach to the wellbeing agenda was relatively top-down. It was a combination of technical expertise led by the New Zealand Treasury with their living standards framework, combined with very high-profile political championship. In contrast, in Wales, they undertook a very substantial, robust public consultation involving over 10,000 voices, which gave the vision there a mandate, legitimacy, and resonance beyond the policy world. And finally, there's the issue of friendly fire. And I think often we see signs that the economic change movement sometimes finds it easier to critique each other over what are ultimately relatively marginal differences. And of course, interrogation of methods and ideas and emphasis of fellow movement members is absolutely vital. It keeps standards high, it keeps the goals bold. But the reality is that such divisions cast a shadow of fragmentation over the economic system change movement, and they imply incoherence, but it also diverts time. And I think we need to be really honest, it drains emotional energy. So how did these various pushbacks against various components of the wider movement play out in the case of indicators? So the first one around system inertia. What we see is that existing metrics are hardwired and soft-wired into government accounting systems, into media analysis and commentary, and into opposition toys. And here I mean what they use to critique the governing party. In terms of lack of bandwidth, very acute here, in that the metric debate can often see something that's a luxury to wait for easier times. Deliberate blockers, we see just defenders of GDP think that it's good enough, think that it actually tracks sufficiently what matters. And then there's also those who are not making the connections between the GDP-orientated policy world and their own concerns and their own issues that they're working on. And we also see the influence of GDP on policy decisions, and people are not making connections with the influence of GDP on policy decisions and the links to their own issues that they're working on. Next is co-option and weak implementation. We see more measures getting created. So in a way, as Ida's also outlined, lack of measures in many countries is not so much the problem. The trick is making those measures matter. And we're facing a situation where over half of the OECD countries have officially multidimensional wellbeing frameworks. Does that mean that over half the OECD countries are well on their way to building wellbeing economies in line with what people and planet need? Absolutely not. So clearly they're not yet making those measures matter. So weak implementation here as well. Also, in terms of an adequate support base, again, the GDP debate is so often not front and center of campaigns. It's not being seen as a lever for potential allies to influence the issues that are pertinent to them. But again, this is an opportunity that I'll come back to in a moment. And again, friendly fire. We so often see, and I think this really speaks to some of Ida's charts with a huge number of different metrics out there. We see this competition of my metric is better than yours. We almost see a new measure of progress or a new alternative coming out from any agency almost every week, it seems, and it's being described as the Wild West, the beyond GDP movement. And so what happens is policymakers are confused and they just stick with GDP. So how do we go about moving on from this pushback and these challenges? How do we bring about cooperation, education, persuasion, and some contestation? So I want to briefly turn to the more general case, and then I'll say what's most relevant for the indicator question. So we need to broach those blockers. We need to map where that possible pushback is coming from. We need to find chinks and pick apart their concepts and explore and critique their defense of business as usual. And we also need to constantly critique the failures of business as usual. I know people say we need to be positive and stop admiring the problem, but so often business as usual is still held up as sufficiently good enough. And so what we need to do is contrast it with how things could be better. And so celebrate the vision, be proactive in outlining the compelling model and how people's lives will be better from a different economic system. We need to build a network of champions, not just from within the movement, but from outside the field, people who have reach and influence beyond circles like this. And equally to that, we need to build a broad base of support. There are a range of examples of people hurting from the current economic system, whether that's manifest in Brexit votes or in other populist trends. And so things inherent in the Earth for All vision, things like community wealth building, just transition, reindustrializing of local economies through the circular economy enterprises, and of course, particularly the universal basic dividend, these can bring tangible benefits for those most disadvantaged by business as usual. And so things like left behind towns and communities really have most to win from such policy changes. So they're an audience with latent potential to support this agenda. We also need to really invest in those intrapreneurs who get it, who are working with inside government, who have power to influence from the within or potential to do so. And they need help to translate these ideas into policy and to convince their colleagues who still have the microchip of business as usual firmly lodged in their brain. They also need protection. They need support to connect and bestow credibility on their work. And finally, it has to be around partnerships. Find common cause, people who are maybe not instinctively part of the economic system change movement. And here I'd identify trade unions as a huge group with latent potential to be part of this. I know some, particularly in Europe, are really stepping up to this agenda, but I think it's almost a dog that has yet to bark in this agenda. But other groups such as churches, business groups such as the World Council on Business and Sustainability, and as we're seeing, particularly health agencies, and particularly as they hold a mirror up to the flaws of the current economic system. And so I want to really briefly think of which of those matter most for how we're going to move forward on the beyond GDP conversation. So for me, the three ones that seem most urgent is really to up the ante on the constant critique. So every time quarterly GDP figures are published, maybe amongst ourselves, we could have a roster or take it in turns, or really just fire up how we're pointing out what those figures don't cover and how they profoundly distort the picture of progress that's being discussed. Secondly, we need to build that broader base. We need to invest in partnerships with other agencies and other actors whose goals are hampered by a GDP policy dominated world. And we need to invest in those entrepreneurs. I suspect, and I hear it, if you feel the same, but I hear it from so many civil servants who say, we all understand the flaws of GDP. So we need to take them up on that and say, okay, now, so what? How are we going to go beyond such a flawed indicator that apparently so many people agree on to actually changing the indicator architecture of government systems? So finally, I just want to point out that we need to also show the role of indicators in systems change. This isn't just because we have some narrow focus on kicking out of GDP and stopping there. The reason why there's a beyond GDP movement is because they matter to policy development, and that matters to outcomes on people's lives today and tomorrow and into the future. So look back, look from right to left on this little arc here. And just, this is something I think we need to really keep emphasizing in conversations around indicators, that the ultimate goal is shared well-being on a healthy planet. That needs to be underpinned by economic system change, a wellbeing economy that's underpinned by the earth for all ideas. That is then dependent on reshaping government. So using policy instruments to bolster what we need more of and to power down economic activities that are misaligned with what people and planet need. And then that, over to the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, this means we need to really reshape what goals and processes pertain in government. And essentially, this is because better indicators lead to a better picture of state of play and how far we are from our real ultimate goals. We have better indicators, that then gives us better analysis, which gives us better policy proposals, which leads to better decisions, which leads, most importantly, to better outcomes for people and planet. I'm going to stop there and just share with you a sneaky little glimpse into my dream alternative indicator. Thanks, Sandrine.
Oh, nice, Katherine. Brilliant, really brilliant. So much good food for thought, and we're getting some hearts here. Katherine, before we move, and thank you for also looking very clearly at the benefit of a universal basic dividend and the work also that Ken's going to be bringing next. I think you can see the link between what Ida has presented, and I think there is somehow was a misinterpretation that Ida was referring to one potential indicator. I don't think, and we all know also that GDP itself is not one indicator. It's just that all of the bundled indicators still look at productivity. So the fact of the matter is that what you do bring in, which is so fundamental, is first of all, that accountability and critique element, both of ourselves as well as others. And I do think that so many of those that are working on new indicators are creating too much noise, as well as organizations that are all even talking about new economic models, whether we look at the degrowth, the donut, the green growth, etc. And again, what this workshop is about, and the work of the club through Earth for All, but also what we hope we can do with the EEA and the Commission, is to come back to slightly being agnostic around the final methodology to get to very much what you've indicated, which is we all want to move towards well-being. So what does that look like through some of those indicators that we can choose? What are then the tools that will enable us to move forward, rather than creating a lot of noise around a variety of different indicators, which in the end is going to shoot us in the foot. And that's fundamental. We need to be much more strategic, because the other side, and we're seeing it on a variety of different fronts, are doing everything they possibly can to stay in business as usual. And they're much more strategic in the way in which they're aligned on their messaging. Whereas we're all sitting here bickering over the different types of models that we want to see implemented, rather than focusing collectively on what is the vision, what is that alternative future that we want, and then how do we potentially get there? And yes, there are nuances, but the fact is that we need to be very careful that we don't actually continue to create more noise than actually moving forward. So I think that this is why some of the thinking now that has gone into the universal basic dividend is really interesting, especially this morning, not only in terms of its application within a national sphere, and very much take your point, Katherine, also, and also Ida, on the way in which we can get into averages at the national level and lose actually out on what's really happening, some of the pain points within different communities. But I think that the beauty of UBD is it brings in a variety of different elements. One is, how do we start to ensure that we can properly distribute wealth? Two, how do we start to place a price and a value on the global commons and redistribute that, which comes in now to the pain points that we see around energy poverty, windfall profits, where only a few are actually getting those profits and not the many. And then the last point, and this is something that I just brought up in this OECD conversation, is how can we even think of universal basic dividend as a cross-fertilization of new funds and the allowance of the creation of new capital between North and South, and bringing in a funding pot that starts to really place a value on the global commons and redistribution for citizens. So I'm going to now point this in the direction of Ken, and Ken has an unbelievable history of working in the area of circularity, very much unpacking how an economy can become not only circular but regenerative, and thinking through what are the key tools that we need in order to get ourselves out of the mess that we're in and shift from an extractive economy.
Well, thank you, Sandrine. My background, just for reference, is, as you say, circular economy. I'm a visiting professor at Cranfield University and a fellow of the Institute for Sustainability Leadership at Cambridge University, and I did contribute to the Earth for All book and in its deep dive on the long road to a social dividend. So that's just a sketch on it. And what I wanted to just bring in this afternoon in a very short period of time, it's incredible, I'm just going to take 15 minutes, is this connection between a universal dividend and all of those, many of those things that we want out of a well-being economy. Now, surely just a universal dividend is not going to meet some of these aspirations for a well-being economy, but just look at it in this sort of way. The sort of economy we've got at the moment is most people, Michael Hudson, Steve Keen and others, now characterize it, Brett Christophers as well, as a rentier economy, which is dominated by financial interests, which is dominated by limited competition in markets and deep influence of states, of governments. Now, this is not the old industrial economy of the industrial capitalism with its complement of, say, labor, wage labor. This is much more a precariat, much more a increasingly disempowered population or citizenship versus, if you like, the rentier interests. which are extracting value by their domination of many economic processes. And in particular, with the Club of Rome in mind, one of the big questions is, what about resources? Well, if we just pick on one, which is a very urgent one, of course, is the carbon question. We know that prices should tell the truth if we want to have an economy that is reflecting the real price of its inputs, instead of subsidizing the inputs to the amount of many trillion pounds a year in both, or dollars, in both indirect and direct subsidies. What do we do about that? Well, one of the ideas that's been around for a very long time, at least a couple of 100 years, is this idea that economics is there to deal with the problem of economic rents or unearned surplus in economic systems. In other words, the people earning unearned income and retaining it or reinvesting it in further assets. It's very easy to see that going on at the present, when we come to the end of what has been called the everything bubble. So assets valuations have gone crazy, inequality has risen at the same time. So how to get a hold of this, but do it in a way which is more than about economics. It's about justice, economic justice, compensatory justice. It's an ethical angle on this. And that's super important, because the economics are important, but a well-being economy is about the right sort of economy to enable us to thrive, to enable us to live our lives productively. Now, the basic idea, of course, of a universal dividend is we're co-owners of the resources. And these have been largely captured by people who have enclosed fossil fuel rights, minerals, have dominated particular aspects of the land market to increase land values. Now, this is a clear case of, well, if it's been enclosed, if they have been able to inherit value from previous generations, what about us inheriting value from previous generations or existing resources? And so you get this idea that if we were able to charge fees on carbon, for example, just use the carbon example, high up the supply chain, we could funnel this through a citizens' wealth fund or a commons wealth fund and distribute it to everybody in the country, because it's part of their compensation for their share in the ownership of these resources. Earth for all, you know, it's a classic phrase and a classic opportunity to do these sorts of things. But it's quite important, I believe, because of the way it leverages, well, a different perspective on the economy and what it's for. It needn't stop with fossil fuels or carbon or the atmosphere. It could include things like financial transaction taxes, or it could include attention to other forms of oligopoly or monopoly, where essentially you've got unearned income, and the universal dividend advocates say that we should capture some of that and give it back to people. It's nothing too difficult about this, but it contributes to looking at the economy in a very different way. So that's all I want to get into really at the moment. It's just a short pointer towards the relevance of universal dividend discussions, towards looking towards a well-being economy, because it starts with the ethics, it starts with the justice, the economic justice. You've got ecological justice in there, because you'd be paying the real price for resources. They would be conserved because the real cost would be reflected in the price. And yet you're able to compensate the poor, who usually get it in the neck, as it were, if there are price rises around fuels, they're compensated. And as American friends say, what's not to like about this? Because it is written in a way that you're not taking from one group something that they've earned, you're taking something from a group which is an unearned income, has come from the market structure or from the control of the resources. So it's not necessary to keep their business going. It's a surplus which all economists in the classical tradition, from Adam Smith through to Thorstein Veblen to Henry George, Karl Marx, have tried to deal with the problem of what to do with economic rents. And it keeps popping up, and I think now is a very good time for it to appear in a more structured form, because we have the technologies now which would enable, not only in the north but in the south too, the distribution of such a dividend, mobile payments, and all of this is spreading very rapidly in its present. So we could do it, you see. Now, when it applies to things like a universal dividend, it helps with the gender thing. It helps not only with poverty, inequality, with gender. If all women are receiving a dividend, it's a little bit of a foundation on which they can say yes and no to things that they were at the current time having to say yes to, And it also says, I don't want that particular job if you push it. My well-being means I'm not going to do that job. It's a freedom to say no, to make a better deal, because in a way citizens are protected. And I think that's a flavor of what we've been talking about. So I'll leave that there, I'm conscious of time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Ken. And if I could have had all of you in the incredible workshop that we had this morning, also the discussion between the comparison of what a universal basic dividend is versus, for example, a universal basic income. And also in speaking with some of those that have been working in this area for such a long time to understand where the pain points are, Katherine, in the way that we've just tried to do now in terms of new models towards well-being. There are pain points around just those three letters of universal basic income, and the way in which, some parties are pushing against it because clearly it means that it's social handouts. Others believe that it doesn't really reflect the needs of the population. But I think what was very interesting, Ken, this morning, and where we landed, is that this is about sharing of assets. And that we actually all should be owners of the global commons, and that actually the global commons are being used by a few in order to go into the pockets of a few. So it builds very nicely some of that narrative, that political narrative, also, Katherine, that you were pointing to, the bringing more people on the journey, that's fundamental. Clearly, we're going to get pushback from those that currently own those assets. But I think that it's very important to think through, well, then what is the narrative for people, for citizens? How do we then create the levers for change through citizen assemblies, and think through the types of consultations that we need, and as well as building the level of trust within organizations so that we have brave leaders who feel that they have the capacity to lead, as you were indicating, through entrepreneurs, which I think is super important. So I'm going to open this up now, but I'm going to first ask Philippe for his thinking as he reflects on what he's just heard, and also some of the conversations, Philippe, that you're having internally, because I'm sure that you're getting a lot of this pushback as you're discussing these issues amongst the European members of Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. But frankly, I don't know what I can add to what Katherine has been saying, because she has summarized very well the kind of resistance that we are meeting. And I think her classification was really useful. And I've met all forms of resistance there. So frankly, well, of course, I could illustrate it with names and parties, but I'm not sure that this is in any way helpful. So that's precisely the goal of the conference that we are going to have in May, is to, how should I say, try to have some intellectual contagion, and starting from the point that if leaders like von der Leyen are attending such an event, maybe you can be authorized as a civil servant or as a politician to take these ideas a bit more seriously. So that's, well, basically what we're trying to achieve is lowering the defense barriers during that conference. That's exactly what we try to achieve. Now, I don't know whether we are going to be successful, but at least I can say that, and again, it may be idiosyncratic, but when I compare the reaction of the entourage of Juncker 5 years ago and the one of von der Leyen this time, I can already see that the degree of resistance has become lower. But again, it may be idiosyncratic because here I'm talking about two individuals. I'm not sure that the decision-making structure in the European Commission, in the European Council, or in the European Parliament has really become more, say, open to rethink the paradigm. Because what I think is actually that, well, the most intelligent opponents actually realize what this means. And I think it was Ken, I think, saying that, well, they realize that, well, being the beneficiaries of the current model, if we really do a paradigm shift, then they will end up being on the losing end of that. Because I don't believe that you can do a change of paradigm that is win-win-win, you know. That is just fooling ourselves. I mean, there are people who are massively, I mean, the rentiers of the current system are massively benefiting from it. And if we change the system, well, the aim is to eliminate those rents. And I can imagine that those who benefit from these rents won't spontaneously agree with that. And then, of course, they use, and at the moment, the two most widely used defenses that are being used is actually jobs and prices. Yeah, you want to put a price on carbon, so look, the people who are already not so well off will revolt. It's interesting, for instance, that the objection about the possibility of a European-wide Gilets jaunes movements, this is not coming from the trade unions. This is coming from the business federations. It's coming from the right-wing parties. And all of a sudden, they do care about the Gilets jaunes. Interesting, right? Actually, they are using that because they have no willingness to rethink the taxation, social security systems to make them real instruments at reducing inequality. And the other thing is about jobs, of course. You want the electric car? Are you crazy? This requires many less jobs to make. So let's continue doing internal combustion engine cars. So this is a kind of argument, if you want to call it like that, that resonates, of course, with the wider public. And it's interesting that we always have to make the point, guys, this is about making the planet livable, right? Because if we don't do this, there will be no economy to speak of. But we still get this thing about, you know, it's about jobs, it's about affordable food, it's about affordable cars, it's about affordable air travel and all the rest of it. So, and of course, with the energy price crisis that we have now due to the invasion in Ukraine, these arguments gain more traction. So well, we are up against strong forces, of course, which doesn't mean we should give up. But again, Katherine, you did a very good job at laying out actually the landscape.
Thank you so much, Philippe. I really appreciate the honesty of what's happening, and also the fact that luckily, well, or unluckily, it seems that already some of our instinct and the interviews that Katherine has undertaken and the conversations that we've been having have shown exactly what you're going through and the discussions that you're having. So what I would like to do is to really see with you, and I don't know how long you can stay, and also with Hans and all of those that are here, there's also a very good point around the difference between policy making and politics. And we can see that even when we go through a process of thinking that we've done the right thing, take the taxonomy, for example, 2.5 years of unpacking the right criteria, going through the science, fully evidence-based, building actually all of that trust across what we thought were different DGs that we're supporting inside the European Commission. And on top of it, working with the financial institutions, European Investment Bank, etc., all in agreement. And then the politics kick in, and we get France and Germany deciding that nuclear and gas need to be included. And I think that this is a really good point. And you, Philippe, being in the thick of it, obviously know that. So how can we, as a group of stakeholders who are working in this area, truly foster the shift that we need, both in terms of decreasing the noise around the variety of different indicators, taking into consideration the real pain points on the ground, so we shift from just moving into metrics and accounts and statistics into the real politics. And what does that look like? And what is our role as a community of actors trying to do the right thing in order to move forward? How can we enhance our strategic thinking and create an engine room to actually make this work? That's my question to all of you. I would like you to come forward with some of your questions, maybe some comments, but I would really like you to think through the conversation. I don't want to get caught up in a conversation around, oh, well, I'm doing this and I'm doing that, because again, that's not helpful. It's just more noise. Apologies. Let's think through collectively, what does this look like now as we are facing the greatest opportunity we've ever had. By the way, we're in a legacy year making, where, if you're right, Philippe, we could tap in to von der Leyen's openness to a well-being economy. It was in her State of the Union address in 2020. We do have European parliamentarians from the right that have joined you, although I know that there's a lot of pressure there on their side. How can we use this opportunity to move the ball? So I'm going to open it now for questions, and I'm going to put it in the broader view so I can see, hopefully, all of you. And if I don't see your hand up, please then just speak. Yeah, okay. For the moment, I don't see any questions, thoughts, reflections. I'm seeing it in the chat. Do some of the speakers actually have reflections on each other's inputs that maybe we could bring forward as well?
Sandrine, if I may.
Yes, Philippe,
yes.
and then I see Sama is also coming.
Well,
yeah. Go ahead,
you guys, and I would say more widely, the scientific community will not be able to rid us of politics. I mean, politics is just there. And again, not to put it very bluntly, if the price of a second term for Ursula von der Leyen is twisting the taxonomy, we should even reflect, okay, is that a price worth paying? Because that's the kind of calculus. She could not possibly open a war front with Macron, especially with him at that stage. And again, if she had opened it, maybe she would have, ended up being shot down in flames at the end of the term. I don't know whether she will run for a second one, but in my view, to be very honest, she's our best chance of pursuing this agenda next time. So what needs to be done now is to fuel possibly her and her entourage with I would say, thought leadership pieces for the next term, because we are already in that perspective, I think. And the other front that I would look at is really on the front of the economics profession, is that, well, we need to have an increasing share of the trained economists, and we need, well, influencing voices from that world talking to the technocrats in the commission, and technocrats not being meant as derogatory. I mean the people who are really doing the models, doing the briefings that feed into policy making. And there we really need contagion. We need contagion that, yes, okay, yes, we know GDP is comfortable, etc. But someone wrote, I think, in the chat that with GDP you don't see the policy trade-offs. But I think an increasing numbers of civil servants in the European Commission see that indeed we need to see the trade-offs. And so giving them comfort that yes, we do have tools and instruments to make them visible, and you know, they like numbers, of course, and because it gives an impression of solidity, which is sometimes dubious, but working, I would say the scientific community must feed into all this and give them comfort that yes, they are not totally on shaky ground in trying to move out of the current paradigm. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Philippe. So I want to bring in, I know there is Sama, then I will bring in Martin, and then Harold has his hand up. I don't see any, yes, sorry. And then I see Adam and Jonathan as well. Oh, sorry. There's also Amy. Okay, well, we'll go through this. I'm going to have to see who put their hand up first. But why don't you start, Sama? And one quick reflection on Philippe, on your point, is that I think many of us are in agreement with you that it is this current president that would be our best bet for continuing this conversation and actually pulling it into an actionable policy agenda if she's reelected. So we do need to think through, well, what does that look like then in order to support her so that she can confront the pushback that she will be getting from her own party and others. Sama.
Thank you very much for organizing the event, Sandrine and Club of Rome, and really interesting presentations by Ida, Katherine, Ken, and great to hear Philippe's reflections. A couple of thoughts, just reflecting on what people have said. So one of the things I thought, Katherine, in terms of solutions, what I was expecting you to mention, but you didn't, but probably it is in there, packed in there, is the link between beyond GDP, sort of, alternative GDP measures and actual policies. And you kind of mentioned it, that graph you showed at the end showing how sort of what, the goal is not indicators, it's not new indicators, it's policies, I think is exactly, is spot on. And I guess one of the perhaps solutions is making the link between those policies and those indicators more and more. And I think the universal basic dividend is a good example of that. And I think that we need to build those links between our the indicator work and the actual policy solutions, because it's the policy solutions which are going to excite the public, not the indicators, I would say. The policy solutions and of course the vision that they're connected with. And then a second point, which is I guess around thinking about Ida's presentation, was really sort of amazing how much work you've done there in terms of bringing all these indicators together. I think I did a similar. I think I made a similar effort a decade ago, and there was a bit less then, so it was a bit easier. And you've obviously had to deal with a lot more information now. And I'm just wondering what your. I'm wondering what your sort of. I mean, you haven't finished that study, but I know you've done lots of other studies of similar kinds. I'm just wondering what your recommendations are now, because we do have a lot of indicators. Yes. Does that mean that we shouldn't be developing many more indicators? Does that mean that does that mean that now we just we need to choose one, or or choose a set of them and go towards decision makers with that basket? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. I would just say one thing, because it hasn't come up so much in the debate today. I do think that one of the things that has been lacking in a lot of this debate, and I sort of hold up my hand as part of the problem here, is that there's been a lack of the bottom-up sort of approach. So a lot of these indicators have been developed by academics, by experts, by people who know how the world works, or who know how the world works, and that may well be sort of scientifically the best way to do things, but it won't get the support, the broad base of support that Katherine mentioned. So I almost feel like we do need to kind of, and there are approaches which have used this, but I do think that we do need to kind of give up a little bit, sort of let go of things and let a bottom-up approach decide what those indicators are. And if we can do that, for example, probably it's easier at sort of a national level rather than EU level, but I think that would be a key way to get things forward.
Excellent point, Sama. And I'm going to take 3 kind of questions, reflections, and then I'm going to let the speakers, and unfortunately Ken had to leave us. I'm going to let the speakers, at least Ida and Katherine, reflect, and then we can go to the next group. So Martin, you are next.
Thank you so much. And I'm really sorry that I cannot switch on my camera, but I'm at the Frankfurt airport, but I couldn't miss this great discussion. Even joining a bit late. I wanted to kind of piggyback on the previous comment and talk about the need for developing policy solutions based on this comprehensive assessment of indicators. But I think it goes into two steps. And by the way, we did this work for DG Research just recently on re-envisioning the TPI as such a policy impactful tool. But I think correctly, like the previous speaker said, we need to first develop a bottom-up synthesis framework for analyzing beyond GDP growth. I think an approach that takes into consideration the visions of citizens and the visions of experts at the same time, so that they reached a synthetic kind of pathway to achieving beyond GDP sustainable development goal. And then these visions need to be tested via a strong evidence-based research. So we cannot leave the policy solutions only in the framework of theorizing, but we need to test whether these are robust claims, these are robust pathways. And based on this combination of sociological kind of analysis and more expert-oriented, data-driven, economic also driven assessment, we can develop alternative policy solutions, alternatives to the ones that have been already proposed. And this is only the first stage. The second stage is then how do we translate this evidence-based research into policy impact? And for this, we need a very kind of ambitious long-term agenda for publicizing these results, publicizing the alternative policy options, creating a whole global, I think, policy outreach campaign that includes annual events, that includes policy conferences, that includes media events. There are other types of analytical frameworks that have become mainstream in public consciousness, and beyond GDP is not one of them. So we need a process of mainstreaming that. This means working with civil society in different countries. This means working with individual experts that are influencing the public debate in different countries. So we get out of this strictly policy debate among EU institutions or other multilateral institutions. Thank you so much.
Martin, thank you for that. And I must confess that this is exactly the reflection that we've been having through the Club of Rome. I mean, I'm sure that you're all familiar with the fact that we've just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth. And I think we all took a step back and thought to ourselves, well, why the hell did most of those scenarios demonstrate where we would be in the 2020s? And here we are, lo and behold, facing the social and environmental tipping points that were demonstrated as possible. And the fact is we need to do things differently. And a lot of what Earth for All does, and I know a lot of the work thinking through alternative futures of many of the new economists and thinking through that Kate Ray works through Donut has been, how do you create these policy outreach campaigns, media events, other types? Fully agree with you. This is what we need to do strategically, and we need to do it together so that we can intertwine our narratives so that it doesn't create even more confusion. So fabulous inputs. So I'm going to take the last person who had their hand up, which was Harold. And then I'll go back to Amy and to Jonathan afterwards, but I just want to give a chance for Katherine and Ida to at least reflect on those inputs. Harold.
Thank you, Sandrine. We'll be very quick. So I was lucky I was handed down this book already from my mom. So it was the German translation that came out in '73 when I was born. I was not handed it down in '73, but not much later. So I was always fascinated how this book has remained relevant through, and this is a bit the sad story of this book, of course. But I wanted to very briefly make 2 points. Independent of this excellent work that you're doing, and also the compass that Janes has put together, this is absolutely brilliant stuff. But independent of that, even everything we do and every indicator we may find, and so all this excellent work, there are 2 things that have the potential to crash all that and to make it not work anyway. And those are permacrisis and we discussed this in the Commission also actively, how to deal with permacrisis, and then the demographic megatrend. Permacrisis means that policymakers, including our current president, and it would not be different for her or than for anybody else. Permacrisis means it produces a constant short-termism in policymaking, because the current crisis on your hands, be it a pandemic or a war, and there will be other things coming up. So there seems to be a more and more consensus that we are in a world of permacrisis, and there will be every year now a big crisis that needs to be managed, and with very limited capacity to manage a crisis, and that focuses all the policy forces, and you always then trade off some improvement on the long-term indicators for just getting the current crisis under control. So I think this short-termism by permacrisis is a very acute and real danger to make any progress on these long-term goals. The second one, the demographic megatrend for most regions of the world except Africa and India, is currently more and more an elephant in the room. The demographic imbalance is increasing so rapidly that the pressure on our public finances and the space that is left for policies for anything else than just handling the aging population is diminishing so extremely rapidly. It is really extremely rapid, and policymakers avoid talking about it because it is, of course, extremely difficult to be honest about it. There is the money is melting like butter in the sun. Anything left for other things than taking care of the aging population. And I think one of the authors of Earth for All has outlined, the Norwegian professor, he has outlined very nicely the policy options. I mean, tax the rich and so on. But taxing the rich you can do a few times, and that's fair enough, but that would not solve the problem because you still have permacrisis. The demographic problem does not go away, because the demographic problem you cannot solve with taxing the rich because the money is in the pension funds and all these things. No, the macroeconomic outcome, the only one that is possible is printing money, and printing money. We need to find a consensus in the Western world. The Chinese have started to do it. So if the Chinese have already come to the conclusion that printing money is the solution to funding climate policies, I mean, when on earth, when for heaven's sake, will we come to the same conclusion in the West?
I'm going to interrupt you now, Harold, just to make sure that
I think we have to really make progress there. Otherwise, all the nice indicators will not help us. Thank you.
No, thank you for your point. And also, I mean, I think we forget that, 50 years ago, we were in an empty world and we weren't in the midst of chaos. Now we have to actually decide in the midst of chaos and ensure that we circumvent short-term reactions and short-term policy making and profit making, and move into how do we kind of short circuit the short-term reactions by bringing in levers that will really make a difference in the short term and enable the long-term systems shift. And that is a lot of the conversation that we have in the systems change compass that you referred to, that myself and Janis Potočnik actually wrote and developed, and where we're actually holding workshops in the European Commission on this very point. So thank you for that. I'm going to let Katherine and Ida come in, and then I'm going to ask Amy and Jonathan to reflect after that.
Do you want to go first, Ida, or do you want?
Go ahead, Katherine.
Okay, so yeah, to pick up a couple really, really great questions, and I'd love to be able to dive deeper into all of them, but I'll try to hold back so that we can get through to more questions. So Salma, your point around the need for bottom-up development of indicators is something that is close to my heart. When we sort of first started working together over a decade ago, this is sort of where I came at this from. The final slide I put in there is my sort of thank you slide. Showed something that has been at the back of my mind for a long time, but I've never pushed forward. But our colleagues at the organisation Dark Matter Labs have picked up, and this is an idea for cornerstone indicators, because essentially lots of these beyond GDP measures start really well intentioned, but they often become technical translations. And most everyday people, when they're talking about dashboards and indicators, they're talking about their car, they're not talking about their quality of life. And so there's a real need to sort of build momentum and energy and political demands from wider communities, not just have these sort of lovely, well-intentioned technical translations. And so the idea for cornerstone indicators that Dark Matter Lab are running with is to say, can we get indicators that we know correlate to key dimensions of multidimensional well-being? But they also have to pass a second test, and that is that they have to make intuitive sense to the community in question. And the final slide was the number of girls on bikes. And so I haven't tested this, but I have a hunch that this might tick those boxes, because imagine if the number of girls on bikes is rising in a locality, lots of really, really good contextual things are in place. Parents can afford bikes, they can afford breakfast, the streets are safe, there's local service provision, air pollution won't be so high. So all sorts of things maybe won't cover all bases, but I bet you everyday people, you know, who don't come to conversations like this will think, yeah, that's the sort of community I want to live in. So I haven't tested it, but that's my example. Dark Matter Labs are currently just finalising a project in a municipality in Sweden, and they'll be where they've been doing this with citizens there, and they'll be reporting on that very, very soon. So keep an eye on that. They're also now partnering with David Suzuki Foundation in Canada to undertake a smaller project. So that's a space to watch. I also really heartened by the work of various citizens' assemblies that shows that there is, you know, appetite for this when citizens have this time and the scope to deliberate and discuss with each other. I think, and that really shows that they're ready to go beyond where governments would say the public are at. I think the point around making this matter for policy, I mean, hence that rather ugly arrow that I use, you know, this isn't about indicators for its own sake. This is about to transform analysis, to transform policy making, to transform policy delivery, to transform people's lives. And so it's something I think we need to keep contextualizing. We're not doing indicators just because we're interested in indicators. We're doing it because they matter for people's lives. In Australia, where I am at the moment, there's a big push by a lot of state governments are doing really interesting stuff here. It's really heartening. The Federal Treasury currently is consulting on bringing in a Measuring What Matters project. It's really interesting, pretty small scale consultation. So really we're nudging them on that or cajoling them a bit on that. But there's a real risk that they will just measure what matters and then say, that's enough, job done. So we need to really push, say, no, you need to make those measures matter. That's really key. And I very much mentioned, you know, the short-term crisis that also has been mentioned by Harold and Martin around just how this does sap bandwidth. And it's very acute at the moment. People are saying cost of living crisis is everything in government circles, Ukraine and so on. This is the urgent response. But there is also the problem. These short-term crises undermine the systemic response, and they also are just feeding into each other. We need to see the patterns between them that shows how they're all linked to the wider operating system of the economy. In Australia at the moment, one of the organisations I'm working with, the Centre for Policy Development, has hosted a bit of a tour around the capital cities and around parliamentary corridors and around media studios of Sophie Howe, who was Wales' first Future Generations Commissioner. And I think that's a really great initiative, or similar institutions or similar offices, to really hold this focus on longer term thinking, to really assess how different policies, budgets, investments impact current and future generations' well-being. Really heartened to see the reception she's getting here in Australia with our 3-year political terms. So let's see. I think there's mechanisms like that we could really add to the toolbox and add to the package of solutions. I'll stop there to hear Ida's responses, but thanks, folks.
Thanks, Katherine. Ida.
Thanks, Katherine. That was excellent. I love your example of the how many girls bike, because I think that shows exactly the kind of systems perspective we need, right? It's a proxy, and there's a lot of things we won't be able to measure that we want to measure. But understanding what those proxies are, I think, is critical. And there's quite a few others that I've heard about as well. And they're a perfect way to look at the system in some way. So I agree with a few comments that it's not actually about the indicators themselves, right? An indicator is a tool towards a greater goal. And that goal is ensuring that the population we're looking at has a good high well-being, however we measure it. Again, those indicators are just a tool. Whether Harold asked before, whether it has to be one number. No, of course not. Whether that's one number or a dashboard, that's a whole different conversation that can happen, but I think they're not mutually exclusive. Some people, and it depends who your audience is. Some people do connect better with one number. They just want to go, is it plus or is it minus? Is it higher? Is it lower? That's it. And that's fine. And I think that's one of the big reasons GDP was successful. GDP was successful because it worked for the time it was developed. It provided a crucial service. Once a service that wasn't there was rebuilding after the Great Depression in the US, after World War II. It was a critical tool. And so now whatever indicator we create has to be adaptable to the world as things change. The world will keep evolving, will be changing. Different resources, whether it's currently social capital, environmental capital, the limiting factor, those may change in the future. How do we make sure that whatever tools we use, whether it's indicators or other tools, are adaptable with the times and can be reapproached? I also think it's important to remember that what we can do with things like that, use things, for example, Bhutan, GNH is just one example that's being used, but they use a policy filter. So every policy that gets passed in Bhutan has to go through a GNH filter to see whether that policy will improve the well-being of the population or diminish it. And I've seen firsthand that when I was there, the ministers voting on one policy unanimously to pass it, running through the GNH filter, and then unanimously voting not to actually pass it because they found that although certain parts would get better, overall, the well-being of the population would get worse. And so how do we use these tools to benefit the goal, whether it's policies towards well-being, et cetera? So thank you.
Thanks so much, Ida, and Katherine as well for your responses. Very comprehensive. And I really think that this adaptability aspect is huge. I think we're seeing in the chat as well the need to rethink the narrative, the way in which, again, there's all this noise and we're fitting into the system, you know, where the Kirsten's point right now that has just come up around, we use narrative in the same way. And we always need a number. Well, we are stuck right now trying to place a value on people's lives, place a value on nature, which again is a monetary value that fits in to the extractive economy that we currently have today, simply so that we can start to cost externalities. And yet we know that really you can't place the right value on nature. So how do we do this properly? And this comes back to the point, however, that one of you made, which is around that somehow we do need to understand how we could create the short-term levers within this existing system, which starts to enable us to shift towards that long-term paradigm shift that we really need. So I'm going to let Amy and Jonathan come in, and then I'm going to have Hans give his concluding remarks. I don't see anyone else that's asked for the floor or the screen, but do let me know. Amy.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So just to put some thoughts together, and I think the first one just to is very in line with what has been said around vision-led policy making, because at the end of the day, these indicators are about it's even like a storytelling exercise, or this is what really helps, right? What is the story we want to live in 2013, 2014, 2050, and so on. And sometimes we forget that, and we're kind of very into what the indicator is and how it's perfect or imperfect. I think also that we need to make systems and mental models more visible. So at the end of the day, these indicators that tell us this mismatch between where we're at, high emissions, lost biodiversity, and so on, and where we want to be in, it's very important, but we need to make it more visible that behind those unsustainable results that we have now, we really have a system that we have created, and we have mental models behind that led us to developing this system. And a GDP-centric mindset is at the very source of the unsustainable systems that we have created. But sometimes we don't necessarily develop this idea or make it very visible. So to me, it's really about also having indicators that allow us to see the progress that we are making in systemic change, because we sometimes only try to see the indicators that tell us about the results we're getting, but not really whether we are or not changing the system. I mean, greenhouse gas emissions can be coming down, but because we're kind of fixing the same system. And we need to see that they're coming down because we're actually changing systems. Maybe a last point is about creating networks and spaces for experimentation. What we've seen from the OECD work is that policymakers are sometimes very afraid of proposing new things, of working with in a different way, because it's difficult, and they feel like if they make a mistake, they will be seen by everyone as the people who propose something that didn't go well. So I think creating these spaces, and even for us working in these and trying to support countries to try to experiment more, I would say. So I think that's more or less what I wanted to say.
Thanks so much, Amy. And it's really great to have you. And the OECD is also doing some great work on indicators. And again, you're one of the organizations that we've referred to in this discussion, and the need for all of us to come together. I was just, as you know, on the other OECD conversation, more on climate, and the panel that I sit on. And it's interesting to see that a lot of the work that you're doing was not even integrated in that conversation. So even within organizations, we see this, and we see it within the European Commission and other institutions as well. It's not just your issue within the OECD, but definitely there's a lot of work that has to be done in terms of joining the dots. But also, I really like your point on enhancing experimentation, and what does that actually look like? And then how can we create those positive narratives and storytelling that also Katherine was talking about, the reference points of this actually works and it makes sense for you and your life and your livelihood. So I think that we need to get better at that as well. So Jonathan.
Thanks, Sandrine. Also really grateful for, well, that you're hosting this workshop. And I think you particularly have been what the Club of Rome also has been, the organization is really trying to bring together all those different loose ends that, so we actually create a strong message at this Beyond GDP conference later this year, well, not later, but in May. So you ask, I think, a very good question: how can we stop the noise, and how can we really focus on coherent messaging? And to really be very operational with that, I would really like to bring in, there is the conference. It's happening from 15th of May to the 17th of May. This is the one moment where our messaging needs to be aligned. So we do this as a think tank with our fellows, with like all the different panelists that we have close relations to really like try to brief them on what should be the asks that we bring towards the Commission. And so this is where I think I would like maybe also to hear from you later, Sandrine, what you think should be the messages that we repeat in the different discussions that we have. From our perspective, just to share how we think about this at the moment, there are basically two strands where we think we can lock in this topic also for the future Commission. Obviously, one is the briefings that will be developed like ahead of the next commission. So actually this topic is part of that those briefings, and there are very concrete proposals in these briefings what the commission should be doing to bring the Beyond GDP agenda forward. So that's the one lever. The other lever I think that we should try to use is obviously the electoral programs of the different parties, right? Because we will see a lot of MEPs participating at these panels. So whenever any one of you here is like in the crowd, is part of the audience, please challenge those MEPs if they can make sure that some of these topics are actually becoming relevant in their electoral programs. I think so. These are the two levers. Just also to like build up a bit of a like shared understanding where we need to get strategically with this discussion. Then obviously the question is, what are the key messages, right? And so from Zoe's point of view, we have worked on two main messages that I would like to share here. So one is that the commission needs some kind of guardian internal that is making sure that this agenda is taken forward. I mean, obviously, Hans and the EA has been this kind of internal guardian from my perspective. You have been very strong in like internally trying to push this debate. Our call will be that the commission moves beyond that, and there is actually another high-level expert group. Now it's becoming very boring, but it's unfortunately how the terms are. Another high-level expert group on well-being and sustainability that is actually then taking these indicators forward and is making sure that in the next commission, there is someone always pointing at those topics, coming up with recommendations, coming up with opinions when there are like files in the process, and also act as a spokesperson for indicators, right? So because there are different pieces of legislation that will be developed, and then obviously very often the people just don't know what should be the indicator except of GDP that they can use for these pieces of legislation. So this is one of the demands that we have also been working on with like colleagues in the commission to get internal support. And it would be great if this is kind of echoed from the different people at the conference. The second one is that so I really liked, Katherine, what you have shared about like how do we move beyond just talking about the data and making the data matter, right? So from our analysis, I shared also the link in the chat. We come to the conclusion that it's basically the governance at the end that can make the difference, right? And we have a very successful case here because on CO2, we have successfully changed governance. We have the climate law, we had the effort sharing direction. So we have different pieces of governance that make policymakers continuously look at this particular topic. And so there is already this successful case. And I'm wondering, can we use that case to build up the momentum for like similar governance structures that are then needed, for example, for land use, for resource use, for inequality and well-being, so that it's not only like on the political leadership and the political majorities to choose that these topics are important, but it's actually something inside the commission that is continuously nudging them in this direction. So bringing up this topic of governance would be, from our perspective, the second main message. And then lastly, obviously, those two things support the policy angle, right? And this is where, I mean, there are thousands of different policy options out there, so it's difficult to, I think, align on exactly what is the policy there. But then I would just encourage everyone to come up with very precise ideas, what people have in mind when it comes to putting that into practice. One last comment, and then I'm done. Just on like the next step, because after the conference, there are a couple of Horizon Europe proposals that are funded by the Commission, which is also something nice to see. It will take this agenda forward. Now we'll just put a link in the chat for the Wise Horizons network. So this is like a group of researchers funded by the Commission together with Tim Jackson and Thomas Piketty to really bring this agenda forward. And I really invite you to connect with that so we can also stay connected in the future on these issues.
Fabulous, Jonathan. Thank you for that. And also, I mean, I think what's really beautiful to see is how many of us are really trying to collaborate and work together. I think it's clear that there are many organizations that are now increasingly working in this space. And we're all cognizant of the fact that we also can create additional noise, or we can not create additional noise and actually have a harmonized voice. And I think that is what is absolutely key. I'm going to turn now to Hans, and then I will do exactly as you've said, Jonathan, and bring in a little bit building on what you've just said, what could be done through the conference and beyond. So Hans.
Okay, thanks a lot for this great discussion, great presentations, and good responses and replies to the presentations. I will try to be short in the interest of time, so not too repetitive. I think it's clear from the discussion that these indicators for well-being and sustainability have been a bit like a rocking horse, a lot of movement but little progress in where they are used in the policy making. And that's where Sandrine started. How do we shift to the next level of actually, as Ida has presented so well, you know, collecting almost 400 of these well-being indicators. It's not like there's any shortage of indicators. The people working on them seem to be violent in agreement about most of the stuff that they are working on. Yeah. Now that academics then are trained to criticize each other's work, I think that is part of the academic world from which I come and to which I will go back. I have my doubts about that. It's always the best way to spend our time in academia, but it is the part that we do very well. Yeah, what I think was really critical is when you said that, are these available metrics what we want? In fact, I think they are partially the traditional ones, what quite a number of actors want, because their interests are connected to these indicators. So my question is more, and I come from an agency that is analyzing the state and outlook of the environment, are they what we need rather than what we want? And what we need is indicators that are aligned to the paradigm shift that we are undergoing in science, but also in policy, a paradigm shift towards systemic sustainability transitions. And I don't think that the indicators we have are sufficient for that. And if you go back to Kuhn, which I will not in this case, but the logic of scientific revolution and paradigm shifts, I think we are at that moment also in these indicators. We need to reflect that paradigm shift when it comes to the content, the ontology, and Katherine's example of cycling girls is in essence an ontological question. Where is the knowledge coming from that we are using? Yeah, the role of citizens, which was already emphasized in Agenda 21, but then gloriously ignored in how we used a lot of these indicator sets that had participatory dimensions to them. The role of distribution, the role of planetary boundaries, and all of that. And a good indicator for me is that when MA came in with the OECD's work on it, which we value a lot, by the way. I mean, the OECD used to be the cathedral of traditional economic thinking and growth thinking, and now they are shifting to this. For me, it's an indication that this paradigm shift is happening. Why is the pushback there? I think Katherine emphasized a lot there, but it's in essence because the current indicators are actually at the advantage of some specific interest, and they served Western society rather well in the post-World War II period. But now we live in a different context, and so these new indicators tend to rock the boat because they uncover inequalities and distributional issues. They uncover natural capital issues and the triple planetary crisis. They uncover institutional lock-ins and all of that. So I think it's rather clear why we need to change. Yeah? I am looking for indicators that indicate much better whether we are going in the direction of strong sustainability and not weak sustainability. And that's where I think Katherine's co-option and weak implementation argument is so important. I've observed for 30 years the development of endless indicators by actors who use them as a fig leaf to illustrate how they were moving in a certain direction rather than in the direction of well-being and deep sustainability, and that needs to shift, in my opinion. We also need indicators that are much clearer on the dynamics and the logic of these sustainability transitions, including on the dynamics and the logic of processes of creating or losing well-being, not the terms of sort of static approach. I'm nearing the end, do not despair here. I also think that the points that were made by Ken were really important, because he actually, in my understanding, approaches economics for what it is. It's a social science that talks about distribution, about scarcity, about ethics and justice. Yeah, and in the last 5 decades, economics has been also mostly used in very different ways. So I think that is really critical, because if you approach it in that way and you then add your first class in economics, there are 3 factors of production: capital, labor, and what we used to call land. I take that as the planet's natural resources. You get a very different view of what we should be looking at in economics. And so I think we need metrics that reflect that concept of economics, because that could lead us towards well-being within planetary boundaries. 2 last things. First of all, a lot of this will also be about trade-offs. And I don't think we have very good indicators for trade-offs or mechanisms. And I am increasingly opposed to these endless micro battles that are often very local and based on NIMBYism when it comes to trade-offs. We need a macro understanding about trade-offs. Otherwise, we will not get there. A good example is sustainable mobility. If we want that, we will need infrastructure. We will need to build it in some cases where we need to cut some trees and use some land. If we have micro battles around that, we will not get there. We lose so much social and political capital on that. So I think trade-off indicators at the systemic level would help as well. My last point is that on the pushbacks, we see a lot of pushbacks now on the European Green Deal in general, not only on well-being indicators and post-GDP indicators. And they go from the populist to the ideological, to it's not the time, we have other priorities, to all sorts of things. People can't afford it. I think that rather than dismissing them outright, we should understand their internal logic, even though that might not always be a logic that holds, but their internal logic, even though they don't have external legitimacy given the context that we are facing. Because if we understand their internal logic, we have a better chance of opening up the types of discussions and debates with the proponents of them that we will need to have anyway. So I think they lack external validity, but they have their own internal logic. And we need to connect the discussion. We need to connect those two better. So voila, those were some reflections on the rich discussion that took place today. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hans. And again, I think this is why we really decided to work together with the EEA, with you in particular, and with Peter. Let us not forget that DG Research and Innovation has actually changed its organizational chart and the way in which it works, and it's looking at Horizon funding across people, planet, and prosperity. And that's a start, and that very much fits, Jonathan, your call for new governance systems. I mean, we have to start also internally within the institutions. So as we conclude, just a few thoughts coming out of this incredibly rich conversation. One is we do need to rally around a joint theory of change. And I think most of us are there. We've got most of the evidence. We've got most of the indicators. We've seen it. It's now getting to the crunch time of translating that. And we can use all of the richness of the last 50 years in understanding and unpacking systems thinking, and also looking very clearly at this scenario development, not only of the limits to growth, but so many other types of models and work that's been done to start to look at alternative futures. I think it's very clear that we need to get through that noise and think through, okay, what can we land on which creates an exciting alternative future for more people? How can we then unpack the key indicators that are fundamental for that? And Ida, I'm hoping that through your work and the work that's also being done by the OECD, and we are starting to land on, you know, something between 5 and 10 could be bundled then with GDP. Is that possible? Now, why is that important? Yes, we are moving now into a reflection at the European level that is absolutely live in terms of the political and policy thinking. So this is important. We've now gone from the granularity of the DGs inside the Commission and those that are the statisticians thinking through this. And it's going to be a live conversation with policymakers in the middle of May. But it's also live in the UN right now, as the UN is debating whether, coming back to, Ida, your very good point on the number of SDGs that are actually being translated into potential indicators, they're debating whether we're ever going to make it through the SDGs, because we know full well that most countries are not implementing the SDGs. So they need to simplify that as well. And in fact, we've been asked to come up with a system dynamic model that starts to look at the SDGs. How can we focus on key indicators where actually, without cherry picking, we can start to see, okay, well, what is real human development and economic development in the 21st century? What does that look like? And how can we align countries around that? So now all of a sudden we're seeing that the May conversation becomes a trigger mechanism for a broader conversation within the UN. So one of the things that I want all of us to get our heads around is the feedback loops, which then also goes into the incredible work that Amy and her team and others are doing in the OECD. We need to get better at cross-fertilizing that, creating those intrapreneurs, exactly as Katherine says, tapping into those courageous champions that need help within their institutions in order for us to build this body of evidence and championing of what it is to shift to that alternative future. So that means while we're creating that momentum, and I think we're in the midst of it, all of us, let's be very, very strategic and think through, are we creating more noise, or are we really aligning across a singular message, as singular as we can possibly get, knowing full well, and yes, Hans, this is part of the academic rigor that we need to test each other. But I'm going to be very honest. We are our own worst enemies. If you look at the way in which the Democrats in the United States are accepting everybody and their grandmother as part of who they want to protect and reflect, and yet the Republicans are very clear on who they don't want in, we need to get better at understanding that we have to be very specific around the messaging, and we have to really think through exactly as you say, who are the key losers? And how do we bring them on board? And how do we ensure that this doesn't become another grand political discourse, which then gets shot down because we haven't thought through the other side? And that is absolutely fundamental. And it talks about the pain points that Katherine was talking about in terms of your discussions with well-being economies. So what does that actually mean? As I said, I really believe we are onto something right now. God damn it, it's taken us 50 years to get here. Apologies, but you all know that we are so frustrated, not only at the Club of Rome, but all of the incredible members of the club and the way in which we all believe that we're living exactly what was predicted 50 years ago. Let's not let this moment pass us by being either complacent in our own thinking and our own theory of change, and not thinking through those pain points that are so important, not actually helping Ida and thinking through, okay, as we go through that process of filtering through all those indicators and all the other indicators, can we start to focus? And then coming in with some really clear tools in the toolbox and the calls for action. And that comes to your point, Jonathan. What do we then do in terms of calling for the commission, either an advisory council? Now, the only problem with an advisory council is that's kind of what the taxonomy group was supposed to be, and then the politics kicked in. So in some ways, you need to create an advisory council, but you also need to create an observatory that continuously holds these politicians accountable and the thinking accountable. So in that sense, we need to almost have two bodies and think through what that actually looks like. We do need to have a specific call for policy shift and a directive some kind of new policy call for looking, addressing indicators and working with member states to translate that into a real dialogue between the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council to see if we can actually get something either through this legacy year for a president that needs to make her mark, but by the same token needs to have votes in order to continue into the next presidency, which we hope she will have, from the EPP party. And that comes back to the point that whatever we propose has to be stress tested and has to be addressed from an EPP lens, because no one is going to stick their neck out, in particular this commission, if it doesn't also, unfortunately, somehow take into consideration those key arguments that the EPP and other parties are going to bring forward who are not necessarily already on the bandwagon. So I think it's very important that we think about that as we're moving forward. There are going to be clear calls to action as we go through this conference. But again, as I said, I think it's really important that we create those feedback loops with the UN process. Last point, we don't talk enough about the fact that the current system is broken. We don't talk enough about the fact that we've got the highest amount of mental illness, that this is the first generation that's going to make less than its parents. These are all things that actually can bring the right on board. We don't talk enough about the cracks in the system that don't actually enable productivity in the way in which it should be enabled, which also talks about local production for local consumption, brings in rural communities, which are the populist communities, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to be a hell of a lot more creative in terms of the way in which we build that narrative. And so I'll close with that. I think that there will be a variety of different op-eds, and there should be. We should think through and align our efforts in terms of where are the different op-eds, where is the messaging, and we should actually all come across at least some key points that we want to call for in terms of this particular conference, but also at the level of the UN, the Macron Summit, or the Paris Summit that's coming up, which is going to be held with Mia Mottley, Bridgetown Initiative, and also with India, because that comes back to also some of the pressure points around the G20, the G7, and the way in which we're actually looking at the broader international agenda and the conversations that we're having around reform. So we can't just get caught up in our little bubble. I know that sounds incredibly complex, but I actually think we already know where we can create those feedback loops. And we can do that quite neatly if we're smart by putting together our strategic heads and thinking through what those calls to action could actually look like. I don't think we're going to have already that narrowed metrics position where we could say, oh, we only need 6 or 5 or 7 indicators, but we can at least do what we've done through the well-being economy push, which is we know we need environmental, economic, and social indicators. We've got economies that are already showing that they're moving in this direction, and really put forward that storytelling, calling then on the European Commission and the European institutions to build on that as the leadership that they should be to ensure that a green and social deal is truly implemented across Europe. So those would be some of my recommendations. I like the points that all of you have brought. We have recorded this. We will come back with a follow-up note on what has actually been said. I want to thank the speakers, Katherine, Ida, and Ken, and Hans, of course, for your partnership alongside the European Commission, and of course, the incredible leadership of Philippe Lambert. I don't know, Philippe, if you've joined us again, but so appreciative of the way in which Philippe is really driving this inside the European Parliament. And I hope that together we can really bring forward some clear objectives coming out of this May meeting, and then building up continued momentum to hold the Commission and the European institutions accountable in terms of next steps. Have a great rest of the day. That was a huge mouthful, and I'll see you again all soon. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Let's go to the,
Stop the recording.
okay.